The interesting thing is the proof in the pudding for a compliance market is, does it, you can't just create it and walk away. Like, you have to see if it actually did the thing that it was designed to do, which is disincentivize high carbon emitting activity and incentivize low carbon emitting activity. And until you see that really happening, you really haven't done a whole lot.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Climate Tech 360, where we connect with diverse voices in the climate sector to make informed choices in supporting the future of climate tech. I'm your host, Samia, and today I am speaking with Hayne Park. Hayne is a former colleague of mine, and I've known him for about 10 years now. He has been trading global commodity markets for nearly 20 years, spanning multiple commodities in both physical and financial markets. He's previously worked at both hedge funds and merchant trading houses in New York, Switzerland, and London, where he now resides. Hayne holds a PhD in physics from Columbia University and a BA in physics from Harvard University. He's both knowledgeable and deeply interested in the role of energy markets in the global landscape, how the green energy transition is changing relationships across commodities, and how to leverage technology in the financial markets. In this episode, we get a trader's perspective on carbon markets and pricing with a focus on EU ETS. We talk about carbon trading versus carbon tax and the importance of technology in our path to net zero. And I will add a disclaimer here stating that the opinions in this podcast are solely his own and not of any current or past employer. Any investment descriptions are purely illustrative and do not correspond to any existing or past investment. And now onto the episode. I was expecting you to be all dressed up.
At least I'm wearing a collared shirt.
You have like a Hawaiian shirt on.
It is a Hawaiian shirt. And if you look very closely, this is actually my cat.
That's a picture of your cat?
Yeah, they got this for me.
You're wearing a shirt with a picture of your cat?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. How crazy is this? This is a podcast, right? This is not a video, right?
You are my kind of person. I am recording the video, but I don't use it.
Good.
So let's start. I'm just going to launch us off with one question and then you can take it from there. But basically, I would love for you to be able to break down the compliance market for us, because we have, when I think about carbon markets and pricing, we have sort of the compliance markets, of which the most developed is the EU ETS. But then each country, if they're trading, has their own market. So like, and not every country does, but New Zealand, South Korea, California, parts of the East Coast. Then you have the voluntary markets, the VCM, where the carbon pricing ranges from 1 to 1,000, depending on the technology. But then you also have carbon tax, which is a fixed price on carbon, and now potentially a border tax. And then on top of all of that, this is internal, but corporates have their own internal prices that they set for themselves in terms of carbon pricing.
Yeah, the devil is going to be in the details of that one thing, because it's actually not one thing. It's a variety of different instruments that are all trying to accomplish the same thing, which is to incentivize via market-based mechanisms to incentivize people who produce carbon, so industrial processes and so on, to reduce the amount of carbon that they are emitting into the atmosphere. Now, this can occur via a variety of means. It can occur by, the harshest one is by just shutting down. If the carbon price is so high that you cannot make your business work anymore, then okay, I'm just going to shut down. That would be the harshest thing to do. But less high carbon prices will, or at least theoretically, are supposed to encourage firms to find technological ways to reduce the amount of carbon that they're emitting. For example, by putting specialized capture devices at their exhausts and things like this. There's another idea where they're baking the carbon into cement blocks to try to mitigate the amount of carbon being emitted while during these industrial processes. That's the technological aspect. And then the third of it is to just change their processes, to make things a bit more efficient, to use the energy in a more efficient way, and so on and so forth. So it all boils down to, I think, the most fundamental problem in economics is always this idea of dealing with externalities, i.e., how do you get someone to properly pay for the thing that they are actually consuming? And up to this point, we've just let people essentially damage the earth by not
Right.
charging for carbon emissions. And this is trying to correct for this.
Right. But all of those things that I just mentioned, like VCM, the compliance markets, ETS, cap and trade, all of that is still a price for a ton of emitting carbon into the atmosphere, right?
Right.
It's still effectively all trying to price the same thing, same unit.
Yes. And it's all trying to price the same thing, except you get a very different price because different places have established different rules. Now, the contradiction arises because once that carbon dioxide molecule is released into the atmosphere, it doesn't really care whether it was released in a 65 euro environment like the EU ETS, or if it was released in a there's no price environment like India or other countries that don't have a carbon market. So at the end of the day, a carbon molecule going into the atmosphere is a carbon molecule going into the atmosphere, and then we all collectively pay for it. But we get these different prices because the certain systems are more stringent about the amount of total carbon that can be emitted than others. The EU ETS is the most stringent one. And even then, it gets criticism about not being enough, and we can get more into that later. But the EU is the tightest one, followed by other systems like the various regional ones in the US. China has had one for a while that's in the single digits. That's a compliance market. And by compliance market, we mean you are legally required to pay for your carbon. Now, not all industries are covered. For example, even in the strictest market, like the EU ETS, sectors such as transportation and buildings and so on. So roughly in the EU, the EU emits about 2.7 gigatons, 2.7 billion tons of carbon in aggregate every year, just across everything. And the ETS only covers about 1.2 billion tons of that. So it covers a little bit less than half the sector.
Yeah. And is there a path towards covering the whole sector, or there's really no way to do that?
Well, this is one of those things where if you want to do it more thoroughly and you want to do it faster, it's going to be more costly. Nothing is impossible, but certain things are more painful than others. If you were to go out and say buildings have to be covered, transport have to be covered, all these things have to be covered, you would immediately get a adder on things like gasoline fuel, diesel fuel, heating for your building, the all-important agricultural emissions, and so on. And then you would probably have wide-scale protests like you've never seen before. So when the EU ETS was first set up and launched, it was really, they went after the utilities first because they were the most easily identifiable. They didn't form a huge voting bloc, for example. And even then, they had to give away most of the credits for free in the very beginning just to get this thing to pass. So it really is, you start out from a level of what is possible. Nothing is impossible. But then you have to rapidly descale to what is politically viable.
And that was established in 2005, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's evolved a lot since then, right? When you look at carbon pricing, there were, I think, years in like 2005 where it went all the way down to something like 5. And now it sort of trades within the 60 to 100 euro range. Is that correct?
That's right. It's even been worse than that. So it's gone to 0. So it's rather than evolution, it has died multiple times. And the EU has revived it many times along the way. That first phase from the very early days, the price actually went to 0 because the system was set up so that it was oversupplied. Like there were more credits than were actually needed by emitting institutions. And thus the incremental price for these credits was nothing. So it went to 0. And what they did to fix that was usually they had this vision where you would be allowed to take a credit and kind of save it for future years. Well, they shut that down in 2007. So you cannot bank them to 2008. They expire in 2007. So the 2007 credits went to zero. The 2008 credits went up and down, and they reached as low as €4 because the system was still oversupplied. We went through several recessions. The GFC in '08 did more to abate carbon than perhaps anything else up to this point, the financial crisis. And then you had a bunch of other hiccups along the way. But then after letting the price languish kind of at the €4 per ton kind of level for a very long time, additional measures were created to patch that up. They canceled some credits. They made mechanisms called the Market Stability Reserve and a variety of other things that would mop up excess credits, not destroy them, but tuck them away and then bring them back later when the market cleaned up a bit more. So after many, many years of this, we got to a position where it's about €65 today.
Okay, so EU ETS, this was developed in 2005, and it's a compliance trading market. I have some basic questions they're very basic questions, but you guys have a carbon trading desk. You're a carbon trader. What do you see on your screen? Like, I know with equities, you can see real-time, anyone can see real-time prices. If you're a bond trader, you get levels from a trader in your Bloomberg. What does a carbon markets trader see? And then when he gets to his desk, what's he looking for? Like, what economic indicators? I assume, it's tied to energy prices. What's a day in the life of a carbon trader?
So I can't speak to specifics about our operations, but what I can do is speak to very general things. And for a hypothetical, what would an average participant in this market look like? So it'll depend on the sort of participant that you are. There's all kinds of different ones in this market, the EU ETS compliance market. There's utilities like power plants that actually consume these credits and retire them. There are industrials that do the same, except the industrials are still in a position where they get their credits for free still. And so they would typically be more on the selling side, if
Seller
anything.
side, right.
Yeah. There are investment banks that provide intermediary services. There are brokers that provide intermediary purposes. There are investment funds. There are even some insurance and pension companies that want to invest in the space and are active in the EUA markets. So it really depends on what sort of participant that you are. But a couple of things that we're all going to be looking at in common is, first of all, just the price. These credits trade on an exchange. They're exchange cleared. They trade on a variety of different exchanges in Europe. And that price is transparent for everyone to see. So you get that price just tick by tick for throughout the trading day, like any other commodity that is traded on futures exchanges, such as WTI oil or natural gas in the US. So you see that. You see the other variety of data that you get for like volume and so on that trades along with you. You see there's an active options market, so you see the options trading with it. So from a price and volume perspective, that's what everybody sees. Now, then you get to what sort of other things are you looking at to make your investment decision or your trading decision, whether to buy or to sell or to time it when versus another period. And that is where everybody tries to look at everything. So naturally, the demand for EU credits is higher when economic activity is very high. So you're looking at indicators of economic activity, be it power consumption, industrial activity, and so on. You're looking at expectations of economic activity, and then you go to the space of economists who are trying to predict, what will happen in Europe if so-and-so is elected? What will happen in Europe if these certain policies are enacted, and so on. And then the last element is that ephemeral market sentiment element, right? It's the EU ETS often trades along with the rest of the commodity complex and often trades away from the rest of the commodity complex and noting when when it trades with and when it trades against is an art form all unto itself. And, in our world, we call it trying to predict correlations and such. Being that this is a market that is largely created by policy, expectations of future policy decisions also weigh heavily into future thinking as well. So if we see political changes on the horizon that may impact the attitude toward environmental goals one way or the other, then that's something that can go into the decision-making process as well. So summarizing, you start all the way from the very microeconomic counting of how many widgets were created and thus translating that to how much carbon was emitted in that widget making process. You go from that very micro to the macro of next year, who's going to be the dominant party and what is going to be their policy on environmental things.
And how liquid is this market and how big is it?
It's fairly liquid. It's one of the more liquid markets in the European energy space. And I'd say that it trades about, on-screen trading volume is probably around 5 to 6 billion tons per year for a market that actually consumes really only about 1.5 billion tons per year. So it's the trading volume is a multiple of the actual consumed quantity. And all good liquid markets like this have that characteristic of you trade more than's actually consumed. So it's fairly liquid.
And just for context, comparatively with other energy markets, how liquid and how big is it?
Well, it's certainly smaller than the big North American markets, such as WTI and Henry Hub and so on. Those are more like global markets, but it's going to be larger than, say, German electricity futures and more regional markets specific to Europe.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's a good sign. And then in terms of liquidity, I don't know if it's possible to share this, but are there big players?
I think that it's pretty evenly divided. First of all, let's answer the question of what's the life cycle? Where do these come from even, right? So the original liquidity, quote unquote, is created by actually government auctions. So much like fiat currency, the only people who can create these credits to sell onto the market are governments. And so the EU has a limit on how many of these can be auctioned per year. So you get these credits in the physical market. Now, what the futures market does is, and it's the futures market that I've been speaking about when we speak about liquidity, trading, and so on, the futures expire into these physical credits. So the futures market is just, matching up sellers and buyers. So who are the liquidity providers? Equivalently, the same question is who trades these things the most? It's an even collection, almost like bits and pieces of equal parts of the big energy companies, the banks, the industrials, and the investment funds, hedge funds, and so on. There's even some participation from potentially retail as well, because through ETFs that own the EU contract physically, they own the future, you can participate in the EU ETS market via ETFs.
So that was my final question. For a retail investor like myself, how would I get involved in this market? How could I trade it?
I'll begin with the caveat that this is neither an endorsement nor a suggestion that retail should. But if you were hell-bent on doing this, there are a variety of ETFs. And this is just on a small scale, right? You're not going to set up a trading account at the Intercontinental Exchange and start posting variational margins. You're not doing that, right?
Yeah.
There are a number of different ETFs. I just know the ticker KRBN is one of these that it doesn't track it 100% tick for tick, but it owns a meaningful portion of its net asset value in the EU ETS future. So it tracks it pretty well. So you won't say own the thing, but you can participate in most of the economic risk of the price movements of the thing.
Okay. So for an individual investor, you could potentially buy an ETF.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to learn a bit more about other countries. Maybe we could spend a few minutes on that.
Sure. The U.S. has several regional markets. In fact, I think the earliest known cap and trade market that worked really well was the U.S. Sulfur market. Like I remember growing up hearing all about acid rain and wear a
Acid
hat so
rain.
your hair doesn't melt off and so on. And now that's not really a thing anymore, right?
Yeah.
And what they did was they did it really, really, really systematically well in the U.S. for the sulfur dioxide market. They figured out what was the scientific measurable limit for what you needed to accomplish, much like this 1.5 degrees, right? And then they backed out of that. Like, how much do you have to mitigate, like this 20 billion tons that we figured out? And then they set the cap at that level and they said, all right, like, figure it out, come hell or high water. And certain industries went away and certain processes were reformed. And all in all, it actually did the thing that it was supposed to do. So going on to the carbon, the Northeast has one, the West has another one, and there are nuances of what is involved in each, but there are more examples of a well-functioning compliance market. China has recently announced a compliance market with great fanfare, but the prices are so low and the flexibility around like how you submit the credit and so on is so high that I personally don't think that it's really going to move the needle that much in its current incarnation. And even they admit that this is really how it's starting. And to be fair, this is how the EU ETS started as well. Grossly oversupplied and, with no teeth.
Yeah.
New Zealand has one, I think.
Yeah, that's new, I think, right?
Yeah, that one is brand new. But the interesting thing is the proof in the pudding for a compliance market is, you can't just create it and walk away. Like you have to see if it actually did the thing that it was designed to do, which is disincentivize high carbon emitting activity and incentivize low carbon emitting activity. And until you see that really happening, you really haven't done a whole lot. And that's perhaps one of the biggest criticisms of the cap and trade system versus, say, a tax, like a flat tax, right? Whereas proponents of a tax will say, well, at least like with a tax, we can take the money, which is a known thing, and then use it efficiently and actually get the result that we want. But these are two different ways of trying to accomplish the same thing, which is to reduce carbon usage. The cap and trade tends to be more activity agnostic. It's sort of, in the cap and trade, you have certainty over how much you will abate by having a cap. What you don't know is exactly how you will get there and what will go away and what will be created.
Yeah.
Right? You don't know the path. Politicians often get very antsy about this because they like to micromanage things, right? And they don't like to leave it to market. With the tax, what you do know is exactly like by taxing certain things and not other things, you exactly know the path, but you don't know if you're going to abate enough to accomplish the thing that you're going to do, right? Some companies may just pass on the tax and say like, all right, we'll just pass it on and continue to do this. And the consumer may just eat it and we'll see it as more inflation. So like every country has to make this call about like how to proceed.
Right. So with cap and trade, you don't have a fixed price and it's very dependent on the markets. But with the tax, you have a fixed price. The governments make a lot of money, but then you're not really decarbonizing some of these industries. Like Shell can afford to pay for it. The utilities will pass it on to the consumer. So it's a balance.
Well, you could. It's actually, I think it's more the other way around. If you do cap and trade and say an energy company may actually survive by making investments, by becoming more efficient, and so on, and continue to drill for oil and so on by just altering some of the behavior, maybe capturing some carbon along the way and so on. With the tax system, you actually have direct control. You can just say, you brought up Shell. You just tell Shell, like, I'm going to slap on 90% taxes on you. And then we're going to use that money to build renewable wind farms, right? That is a direct intervention in the market. Yeah. So if you want that level of control, you go with taxation. If you are happy to just let the market figure it out on its own, and when the market figures it out on its own is when we tend to do things for the least total cost, because the market is constantly minimizing that. You get a net cheaper result than the other way.
Specifically around carbon markets and trading, like, is there a way to structure these markets in a way that accelerates this process of decarbonization, reaching net zero? Like, let's just say we have the sufficient market and carbon is trading now at 200 euro a ton.
Yeah.
How does that reverberate through the system?
Okay, so this is the neat thing about cap and trade systems. You can just tune it, right? Let's take the current limit of 1.5 billion tons for Europe. Now that number actually goes down every year, like 2% for the next couple of years, and then 4.4% for each subsequent year, and then it's set up so that it takes us on this glide path down. Let's be much more aggressive and just start having it, and so on until it gets to something very small. What will happen is, as you note, that you're reducing the supply, so the price of these things will go up. The price of carbon will probably go up to the hundreds of euros. That will feed into the rest of the economy most directly via power price. So electricity prices will easily, if carbon prices double and triple and quadruple from here, electricity prices will double and triple and quadruple from here. And that will cause the inevitable giant amount of inflation. Like, your power bills are just going to skyrocket again, like they did in 22. Your cost of things will also skyrocket because a factory requires electricity to run. So everything will get really, really expensive. Now, what does that mean? That means that people will buy less stuff. Maybe that's what you want to happen, right? To have people buy less stuff. If you consume less, you're gonna emit less into the atmosphere. But a lot of people are obviously going to be pushed into fuel poverty as a result of these skyrocketing prices. The other thing is, if you actually reduce economic activity that's the first shock that's going to happen. Like, a lot of factories are going to shut because they can't keep the lights on, and people will be laid off and they will lose their jobs. So it'll be a double whammy. Their expenses will go up and their ability to make money will just vanish. Now, whenever you post the price like that, if you could actually guarantee like a 300-400 euro carbon price, as you well know, a lot of new technology is going to become viable, right? Like, at that point, carbon capture is economically viable. It won't need subsidies. It won't need all these things. Tidal power will actually be viable. Everybody and their mother will go out, try to build solar farms and wind farms. Like, all of that will accelerate. But that occurs later, after that initial shock happens. And that initial shock is the politically unacceptable thing that blocks us from putting the cap at the right level to limit us at 1.5 degrees centigrade.
And it doesn't really work without having global carbon pricing, right? I mean, you can't just do that in the EU and cause an economic recession.
Because what will happen is then your in-EU steel price will skyrocket, and then people will just import steel from abroad, right? Where they don't face that cost, which is why the EU created this mechanism called the carbon border price mechanism. And that's supposed to adjust for this. So it's all these like kind of bandages along the way. Like, if we all just put this carbon price on at once, you would not need these measures.
And there's no scenario in which that could happen. I mean, there's no way that China is going to do that. There's no way that India is going to do that.
It's really hard. Yeah. But in order to not be entirely, morbid, China does emit a lot. China is the number one emitter on the planet at 10 billion tons, and the U.S. is second at 5 billion tons. But one of the benefits of emitting that much is that kind of, not benefits, but looking on the glasses half full side, is that small percentages can have a big effect, right? A 10% move in the emissions profile of China is 1 billion tons of carbon removed, which is like the collective size of the EU ETS that is covered by the trading system, right? So small percentages in big places can have significant effect. But you need to bring these countries on board and convince them that even though you did not, it's like they came late to the party and you're asking them to split the bill equally, right? It's a tough sell, right?
Yeah.
Now we're all going to be in a collectively worse place if we don't find a way to split the bill, but it's still hard.
I don't know. I'm feeling kind of depressed. How can we end this on a
I'm
more
sorry.
positive
I always struggle with this when I look at this market as well. But there's one wild card in this, in that it's one thing that investment professionals are always bad at, is the role of technology, which is your field, right? It's everybody said like, oh my God, natural gas is going to go to the moon. It's a clean fuel, blah, and so on, many years ago. And then shale happened, right?
Yeah.
And then a couple of years after that, we were talking about a peak oil, and oil was a 3-digit number, and we were going into some seriously hard, deep water projects in Brazil and other places that are quite hard to drill. And then the oil sands happened. And again, like, that's come with its own externalities and issues. But one wild card in all of this is always technology. And that's something hard to predict and time, but it happens on a long time scale, on a regular kind of basis.
And that is it for today's episode with Hayne Park. If you found it useful, please click the subscribe button and leave a positive review, as that helps new listeners discover the show. Thank you for listening, and I hope to catch you on the next one. Bye, everyone.